Good evening. Hard to believe, but it is week 10, and we are going to be going over measuring results tonight. We're getting there, folks. We're getting there. So this is what we're going to be covering today. The first thing we're going to talk about is what goes into this chapter, what goes into this section of the template. And that is, it has two parts, the pilot and the full implementation. So the pilot, well, we'll talk about what each of those is. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time on how you design the metrics that you're going to use for your pilot and for your full implementation. So the first part is what goes into the chapter. The second part is a little bit of a reminder on the how-to. So let's talk about what goes into this section. The results from the pilot study, actually description and the results of the pilot study. The simulation, you can do a simulation if you can't do a hands-on pilot study, but it's rare that you need to do a simulation. Almost always you're able to find some small thing that you can implement. But if you can't, then the simulation will work. So that's the first part, is a little proof of concept of how much you're actually going to save by doing one of your recommendations. The second part of the chapter talks about the plans that you're going to leave for your stakeholder for measuring the improvements, the full improvements of your implementation of your recommendations. And you're going to talk to them, or you're going to write about the suggested metrics that they're going to use, because you're going to be long gone, most likely. Some of you will still, if you're doing it in your workplace, you may still be there and you can help out. But the purpose of this is to leave behind, okay, when you have completed the implementation of all of the recommendations, this is how you determine how well those recommendations are working. So that is what you're going to be doing in the second half of the chapter. Okay, what type of changes might you do? These are both for the pilot and for the full implementation. What results are you going to measure? So might be a change in behavior, might be a change to their process, or it might be a change in the equipment that they're using. All three of those can be used for a pilot and for the full implementation. Let's go over a few of the details for the pilot study. Now, I know that it's not a that you're not piloting a plane, but this is what the design ideas in PowerPoint came up with, and I thought it was pretty cute, so I left it in. But we're going to be doing implement one recommendation. It can be a small part of one recommendation. It needs to be simple, so you need to select the easiest one to implement. It needs to be small. So it can be as small as changing one light bulb, changing or doing something with shutting down one computer, or working with one person. And it should be short. You might just do it once, or you might do it over a course of a few days. The determination of how many days you're going to do it depends on whether or not there's wide variation between the days, like in waste. You know, the waste at a restaurant is going to be very different on the weekend than it is on a Monday afternoon. So you would normally do it in the minimum load or light load and the maximum load. If there's not that much variation, you might just do it once with the typical load. and it should be low or no cost because somebody has to pay for it. Here are some examples. You might work on break room recycling, and then you weigh the recycled waste versus the rest of the waste. Or you might do a computer eco power strip and measure the energy use of the computer with and without the power strip. And then remember, you have to scale up to how much it's going to save over the course of the year, just like you did earlier when you were doing your recommendations to begin with. But now you're basing it on real data. Or if you're doing a training recommendation, then you can create one short training module and test it out with one sample student. It can be a sample student at work, it can be a friend, it can be our intern that we have in the sustainability lab. You want to include a description of the pilot. Doesn't have to be pages and pages long, but you do want to describe what was done, what you did for the pilot. If you need to brief participants, if there's going to be people who are going to be trying the training package, or if they're going to be working on turning off lights or whatever it is that they're going to be doing, you need to brief your participants on the purpose of the measurement, their role, how important it is for them to do, if they're doing it multiple times, that they need to do it as close to possible as the same time each time so that you are collecting reliable data. You might need to give them training in using instruments, like for instance, if you have a programmable thermostat, then you might need to include a little training. And then you want to, you're going to debrief them afterwards. So you want to talk about what they should be looking for, what they might expect to see. And then the second part of that first section is taking a look at the results. So because it's small, there are a lot of times when you're not going to be collecting 25 instances of something. So you need to see what it is that you can collect. For example, you can interview or survey participants. How easy was it for them to do? How much time did it take? Was the process or the procedure challenging for them? And then if you can, you want to calculate the impact, the greenhouse gas reduction, the water or energy savings, and any behavior changes that you noted. And then you want to extrapolate to business-wide implementation over extended time, like annual savings. Like if you're just looking at one light bulb, what happens when they change all their light bulbs out, and what are the savings going to be over a year's time? And then look for lessons learned from the pilot. Now, you're actually probably not going to write it here because you'll probably write it in chapter 10, which actually has a section titled Lessons Learned. If it feels like you really want to write it here, you may, but just save your lessons learned for chapter 10. So, and one of the things you want to be able to do is learn from that on how they need to implement the entire change. Okay, so that's part one, is the pilot. Part two is what your stakeholders should do after they have implemented all of the recommendations that they intend to implement. So this is post-implementation. You need to describe to stakeholders what they need to measure in order to determine whether or not the changes, the recommendations are having the intended, the desired effect. This will help increase their belief in sustainability. It will help increase your credibility. And they will be likely to do more if they see that it's making a difference. So you want to tell them exactly what they need to measure. Are they measuring, the savings? Are they measuring the people's attitudes towards them? And you want to give them step-by-step instructions on how they should gather the data. Now, you want to summarize that in the chapter. In the appendix, you might actually want to give them the form. You might want to prepare a survey that you can have a link and you can provide a copy of the survey. You might want to give them an Excel file, and you have a copy of the Excel file in the appendix, maybe a snip of it in the chapter, so that they know what it is that they're going to do, but they look in the appendix to get the details. Okay, so essentially that's what you need to do in the chapter. You need to have a pilot, and you need to explain to the stakeholder how they are going to measure the results after full implementation. So, what is a metric? Obviously, you all have been learning. This is one of the things that you're going to be evaluated upon as we're going through here. But nevertheless, I just wanted to review a little bit of this. It's similar, well, a lot of it is the same as what you may have done in your audit, but a lot of times in the audit, you may have just collected data and maybe given a couple of charts. Now you want to really think about pre and post kind of measurements. So let's think about how you're going to develop the metrics for the pilot and for the post-implementation. How do you develop a good metric? And I have examples of all of these, each one of these on the subsequent slides. Ideally, they should be direct, objective if you can, adequate. So you might need to have more than one, quantitative if that's possible, disaggregated if that's necessary, practical, and reliable and valid. Let's take a look at each one of those. Direct versus indirect. Direct is when you're measuring what it is that has changed, the actual water savings, or the tests of water quality, or the weight of the waste that is thrown away, or the actual cost. All of those are direct measures of the impact. A lot of times you can't get a direct measure, or you may think that a direct measure is not sufficient. It won't really give the full picture of what the change has been. So you may need to do an indirect measure of the impact, which could include surveys. It could include models like climate change models or simulated impact. And it could include observations, such as observations in health. So those would be indirect measures. Then you need to think about objective versus subjective. And these are different than direct versus indirect, and it's different from the next one also. So objective versus subjective. Objective is external to the mind. So it's measures of the input, the process, the outcomes, it's weight, it's the number of times something happens, it's distance, It's the rate of increase or decrease. Those are all external things that can be measured. And it's very concrete, and it's very good proof. On the other hand, there are many times when you cannot get that, or when having a subjective measure might add to your understanding of the change. So these are perceptions and opinions and attitudes. Those are subjective. So you might have a focus group. After you do your pilot, you might get together the people who were involved and have a focus group and ask them what they thought about it. You might have questionnaires or surveys. You might have somebody keep a journal of how something goes. If you use a rating scale of 1 to 5, technically that is a subjective measure because it's still an opinion or a perception. And their interpretation of how fast or how slow something is changing, that is also subjective. Then there's quantitative versus qualitative. So quantitative is numerical. So that gives you numbers, it gives you the quantity of something. So that would be quantitative. But again, sometimes what you're getting is qualitative. And some of those can be, fairly objective, but they're still qualitative in that they're descriptive details as opposed to numbers. That's described in words. It might be about the color or about the shape, the texture, the sound, the taste, the feel. All of those are qualitative. Now, you may want to disaggregate your data looking at different subgroups. So this one, and we're used to seeing disaggregated data when we're looking at race, ethnicity, gender, things of that nature. But some of you are doing things where location may be something, how far distant somebody is traveling, or what different parts of the different locations within the facility, how they are doing. So you may need to disaggregate your data in order to make good sense of it. And you want to make sure as much as possible, so you want to ask yourself, will your metric produce consistent results? That is reliability. And will it measure what you really want it to measure, which is validity? So let's take a look at these lovely pictures. I think these are great. So you could have results that are reliable. They produce consistent results time after time, but they're wrong. they're off by some amount there, so they're not valid. Or you may have something that is valid, so it measures what you want it to measure, but not very accurately. And so it's kind of scattershot, it doesn't give you the level of accuracy that you would really like to see. Now, you could have something that's neither valid nor reliable. That's the worst case. But what you're aiming for is a measurement that is both valid and reliable. And so you want to try to get consistent results of what it is that you really want to measure. So you want to check your metrics against these questions. You do not have to write, you don't have to write these parts up. These are all this stuff about quantitative, qualitative, subjective versus objective. You do not have to write any of that up. The only thing you have to write in the chapter is about the pilot and about the measures for the stakeholders. But if I see something that could be improved, it's likely to be in these areas. So you want to check your metrics against some of these questions. You want to design your metrics first, and then you want to check them against something like this. The first is utility. Does it actually meet the needs of the user? The second is feasibility. Is it realistic? A lot of times, if you need somebody to do the measurement, it might not be very realistic to ask that person to stop what they're doing in order to take the measurement. So anytime that something takes time and effort, and maybe training and all of that in order to measure results, then you need to worry about the feasibility of it. Propriety, is it legal, ethical, or fair? That's usually not a big deal with us, although sometimes fairness might be of interest. And accuracy. Did your solution make a difference? It needs to be accurate enough so that you can tell whether or not something changed. So determine how you're going to collect the data for the pilot and after the pilot. How are you going to collect the data? Who's going to do it? So the first thing you want to find out is where in the process are you going to measure? So where are you going to measure it? How are you going to measure it? Who's going to do it? Goes back to that feasibility question. When is it going to be done and how often? Now, these things you are going to write up because this will be a detailed description for your stakeholders to know how they're supposed to collect the data for the full implementation. So if you're looking at, so the last one was looking at process, if you're making a process improvement. If you're making a facility improvement, you want to ask the same thing. Where would you measure your facility improvement? This is whether it's for the pilot or whether it's for the full implementation. How are you going to measure it? Who's going to do it? When is it going to be done? And how often? So when you're looking at something like a process, you need to think about how you're going to display it. So you may want to, you have, say, for instance, in one of your steps, you may want to look at whether or not they're picking the right products to eliminate environmental risks. Well, if you do that, you probably would use something like an LCA to look at the entire life cycle impacts. If you're checking on energy and water use, you probably would look at something like a control chart to see the changes over time. If you're looking at whether people are making the correct decision, say, for instance, if you're recycling, you have a recycling decision or a composting decision, and you want to see if they're doing it right, then you would identify the common mistakes there and measure that using maybe a Pareto. And if you're looking at something that you're looking at the variation over, different days of the week, or if you're looking at variation in energy use over the summer versus over the winter, then you might want to use a histogram. Here are some examples of tables or charts that you might use. If you're doing an LCA, you could use a spider chart for each phase of the measuring the impact at each stage of the life cycle. If you're doing resource use, you might use a run chart or a control chart. If you're trying to determine what the problem is or whether a correct decision has been made, then you might use a Pareto chart. If you are looking at the problem or looking at a solution after you've implemented the recommendations, then you might use photographic evidence. A lot of folks use photographs before and after when they're doing this. If you're taking a look at resource use or waste, you may use a table. And if you're looking at, like I said, the variation in the resource use, then you would use a histogram. Think about what strategies you need to do when you're designing the data collection procedures. You need to think about how and when you're going to collect the data. And these are some guidelines there. So you may suggest that they collect data periodically, or you may choose a before and after, the beginning and the end of activities to measure something. Or if you have something that's a behavior change, you may want to initially do it daily, but then check it, do a spot check periodically. So measuring it periodically is something that you would do for new processes like recycling. And I say that because you might do an annual waste audit to see if they're sticking with what they said they were going to do. You probably aren't going to do a frequent waste audit because they're nasty things, and they're just, it's a dirty job. So annual might be the best choice. If you're looking at equipment or facility improvements, you might do it at the beginning. This is your baseline audit, that you measured what it was at the beginning, and then you're going to measure it at the end of the implementation, like light bulb or HVAC or anything like that. And your inputs needed might be the bills, pre and post installation. And then we have something like a behavior change where you might do it initially, you check it every day so that you can give some feedback. Remember, one of our behavior change strategies was to make sure that you catch them when they're doing it. And so you're certain and immediate that you're giving them feedback. And you might use check sheets for that. But then afterwards, you might only do it once in a while. Here are some practical decisions that you need to make. When to collect the data, it depends on why. Are you monitoring? Are you trying to predict what's going to happen? Are you trying to control what's going to happen or do a quality check? And then you need to think about who's going to collect the data. Obviously, well, I was going to say in the pilot, it's you, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's one of the people there at the business. So you need to find out if you need some specific expertise. It'd be nice if they liked the concept of sustainability, so they weren't trying to sabotage it. On the other hand, you don't want somebody that is so biased for sustainability that they're going to tell you it's good, even if it isn't. Do you need access to certain areas or computer programs or whatever? Does it have a cost? In which case, you have to have the authority for that. Is the person available? And is the person motivated? Okay, and then how to collect the data. Think about the types of measurement instruments that are needed. Might be equipment, might be check sheets, might be questionnaires, structured interviews. Equipment can be something as simple as a cup measure or a tape measure, or a luggage scale. You're probably not going to get them to do something with to go out and buy a kilowatt unless they're really, really interested. That's something that you should do. And you already have one, or most of you do. Okay, collecting data using check sheets. There are a lot of different ways you can design a check sheet. And so think it through on exactly what you really want to think about is how you're going to display it. And then how make it as easy as possible for whoever's collecting the data to be able to collect it. So these are some examples of different types of check sheets that you might have, including this is like a turn off end of day checklist where you just are going through and saying, yes, I've done all of these things. And then you want to explain how and what to analyze for full implementation. So think about what you are expecting them to analyze. and what you are expected to analyze. Are you doing a comparison with an expected improvement? Say, for instance, you're doing an LED swap out and it should save $1,000 a year. So you want to compare it with that expected improvement. So is it similar to what the equipment is rated to do? Are you able to reduce the energy use by 30% or 15% or whatever it is? So, or you might compare with a baseline. And one of the things you always have to ask yourself, is this a significant difference or is it normal variation? Remember, things change all the time. People may work longer hours, shorter hours, it may be hotter, it may be colder. There are a lot of reasons why that things may change over time. So you always need to check and see, is this a change that is a significant change, or is it just something that is normal? And there are statistical measures that you can do to try to figure that out. That's a little beyond what we're doing, but if you're interested, we can talk about it. But you can compare year to year, month to month. You can, if it looks like there's a difference, you can see if there's somebody different who did the measurement. Are there any other reasons why there's a difference? We found that there were water leaks that create a huge difference, and that's how they found the water leak, was because it was beyond normal variation. And then you need to ask yourself, are you trying to see if there's a correlation between two different things? And you always want to ask yourself, is it correlation or is it causation? So just because two figures are correlated does not mean that one is causing the other. One of the things that you may find, you may have found this when you were doing your survey back in our previous class, you may find that you have problems with the data collection. Maybe you have somebody that was supposed to collect data every day and they didn't do that. They missed a day, or you're going to collect it 3 times a day and you only have twice a day. So you have missing data. What do you do about that? Or sometimes you realize that you have duplicate data. I had that happen not too long ago when I was doing a survey of what traits people wanted in a new person on the job. And we ended up having some duplicate data. And then every once in a while, you may have an outlier, something that's really, really out of the norm. And you have to decide what you're going to do with that. Is that maybe something that wasn't measured properly? Is there a reason that you would delete it? You want to be careful not to delete it unless you explain that you've deleted something because of a particular reason. Usually you just report the outlier and try to find an explanation for why there is that outlier. Okay, once you have gathered the data, then you usually have to do something with it that will require some kind of digitizing. So a lot of times your data is going to be paper-based, like your check sheets and paper surveys. And so you're going to have to do the manual entry into the computer. Usually you're going to do it for your pilot, but for the full implementation, that's one of those feasibility things that you need to ask is who's going to do that? And you want to help them as much as possible, setting it up so that it's easy for them to enter the data. Because if it's hard, they're not going to do it. You always want to think about when you're designing your data entry forms or data entry Excel worksheet or whatever, you always want to think in a backwards design. You want to first think about how you're going to display the data. and then go back and say, in order to display it that way, how do I need to design my check sheet or my questions on the survey? Okay, so that's entry for data in check sheets and paper surveys. If you're reviewing things like utility bills, policies, then you're going to create a summary table or charts. More of you are using Energy Star Portfolio Manager, and that is awesome. If you don't think your people are going to do that, then you might want to design something in Excel so it's very easy for them to go in and put it in, and it will already create the tables. If there are drawings and illustrations like floor plans, value stream maps, flow charts, and all of that, you may want to scan those into a PDF. And then, of course, photographs, you'll have a digital image. Now, if you're really, really lucky, you might have an organization that has a management information system, in which case some of the data is going to be automated. This could be if they have an assembly line, they're already checking their outputs. And sometimes they're even checking the parts that you want. If not, sometimes it's not too difficult for them to add that in. Now, sometimes you get order forms and you have to put a manual entry, and you want to create those tables and charts. You want to give your stakeholders sample tables and charts and an easy way for them to input the data. And then if you're going to suggest an internet-based survey, then create the Google form for them, and put the questions in an appendix and give them the link. Then you need to think about how it's going to be displayed. So you have to ask yourself, what type of data is it? Is it categorical or continuous? Categorical, a lot of times you may do like a pie chart or a Pareto chart. Continuous, you may do some kind of a line chart, a run chart, or something along those lines. And you have to ask yourself, what kind of display makes sense? What is going to most quickly capture what you're trying to convey to the people, to your stakeholders? Sometimes it's a table, sometimes it's a chart, and sometimes it's both. So make sure that you are providing examples for your stakeholders. Everything that I've been describing so far is what is called completed staff work. And I've talked with some of you about this. Now, this is one of the most important chapters to do that, because you are leaving something for them. So just like when you were doing the recommendations, completed staff work is making sure that that you give them all the information that they need in order to make a decision. In this case, you need to give them all of the tools that they need in order to complete the implementation and measure the change. And that is called completed staff work. So with that, what we've covered today is what goes in the chapter, and that is the pilot, and then the description of what they need to do to measure the full implementation, which will be usually shortly after the implementation. This is not continuous improvement, it's measuring the change that you have made. So whatever is the most logical thing to do to measure the change that is made. Sometimes you can do that immediately afterwards or 1 month afterwards. Sometimes you may have to compare year to year, and it may take a full year. But this is not a continuous improvement. This is measuring the implementation of your changes, the recommendations that you've made. So those are the two parts of the chapter: pilot and the measurement of the full implementation. And then we discussed all the different things you need to think about when you're trying to decide what to measure, how to measure, and how to display what you're doing. And so if you have any questions, please let me know. But for that, for now, I'm going to go ahead and say goodnight.